All right, I want to make a few observations on the nervous system today before we start talking about the development of the spinal cord. That'll be our next major concern, looking at the spinal cord development process. But we're going to look at the overall adult spinal cord first to kind of see where we're going to be going, what we're headed toward in the development process. And before I even do that, I want to make a few comments about the nervous system in general, just to help us understand what's going on with the spinal cord. First of all, we use some terminology in talking about nervous system responses. First of all, receptors. These are sometimes thought of as sensors, things that pick up information from your environment that will be conducted toward your central nervous system. So over here somewhere we have our central nervous system, CNS, and this pathway between the receptor and the central nervous system is referred to as the sensory route or the afferent, A-F-F-E-R-E-N-T, route or sensory route, headed from the receptor to the central nervous system. So this is passing through a portion of the peripheral nervous system to get to the central nervous system. Now the pathway back away from the central nervous system, carrying the message back the other way, that is going to go to parts of the body we call effectors. They bring about the effects of the central nervous system. So your muscles that move your body around, glands that secrete, those sorts of things are the responses that your body will generate from the nervous system. This route going out the other way is the efferent route, E-F-F-E-R-E-N-T, also known as the motor route. Efferent route or motor route. So messages coming into the central nervous system, different sorts of integration of your response happen there in the central nervous system. Then you can send the signal back out the other way along your efferent route, your motor route to the effectors. Now, not all responses out here, these are this response route. Not all these responses have to be generated by receptors. You can do things generated from your central nervous system on its own. So you can have thoughts and reflexes and events that originate here in the central nervous system and go out to the effectors without responding directly to any particular sensory input. The next thing we need to deal with, next topic, is the difference between somatic and autonomic portions of your nervous system. The somatic part of your nervous system is that operates at the conscious level. You have conscious awareness of the events going on in your somatic nervous system. There's a sensory portion and a motor portion to that. You can be aware of visual stimuli, you're aware of odors and tastes and things touching you, your tactile senses, all those things that you can sense that information coming in consciously. That's part of your somatic sensory branch. And then there's a somatic motor branch as well, where the voluntary actions and movements that you do with your skeletal muscles are involved in that. The other branch is that part that operates not at the somatic or conscious awareness level, but in your subconscious, and we call that autonomic. And again, you have incoming information to your central nervous system that is at the subconscious level. We are not consciously aware of our CO2 levels in our blood, for example, but your brain has sensors that will tell you whether or not you need to increase your respiratory rate in response to changing CO2 levels in the blood. So there are a number of different things The presence of food in your stomach stimulates the wall of your stomach to tell your brain to behave in a certain way in response to that stimulus and activate the muscular activities and so forth of your stomach. So you have this autonomic branch, sensory. You also have a motor portion to that sends the signals out to control all sorts of things like the diameter of your blood vessels. Your pupil diameter is something that's very obvious that operates at an autonomic level. But anyway, there are many different responses in your body that are operate at the subconscious level that are considered autonomic. Now, this autonomic branch is not only different in function, what it does, but it's also structurally different within the central nervous system. The parts of the brain and spinal cord that deal with somatic things are separate from those things that deal with the autonomic nervous system. Furthermore, the autonomic nervous system is divided into the parasympathetic and sympathetic. The parasympathetic portion of your autonomic nervous system maintains your steady state under normal, relaxed conditions of your body, the day-to-day routine kinds of autonomic events in your body. The other branch, the sympathetic branch of your autonomic nervous system is usually referred to as the fight or flight response. But any condition that makes you particularly more anxious, more excited, more fearful, all those kinds of responses, that fight or flight response, that's the sympathetic response. So those kind of work with each other, and I always call it a teeter-totter kind of fashion. When your sympathetic system is activated, then your parasympathetic system is inhibited a bit, and when your sympathetic system relaxes and is not very active, your parasympathetic system becomes more active. So these are also in separate regions, operate in different regions of the central nervous system. They do not overlap much with one another in terms of where those neural centers are and where those nerve fibers originate from the central nervous system. Okay, here on the board we have a cross-sectional view of the spinal cord in cross-section. Now this would be within the what's called a vertebral foramen of a vertebra. So the main body of a vertebra would be here, and then there'd be that cavity, that hole passing down through the spinal column that contains the spinal cord. So all this is inside that bony protection of your vertebrae in there. Exiting between your vertebrae, between one vertebra and the next, is the spinal nerve that exits so between each pair of vertebrae, you have a single nerve coming out from there, and that's there, and then there's one on the other side as well. That spinal nerve carries messages out to the body and messages back from the body, so that's part of your peripheral nervous system. Any incoming information, sensory information from the spinal cord is going to be routed up through what's called the dorsal root. Of the spinal nerve, dorsal root of the spinal nerve there. So the incoming information comes into your spinal cord up here. Outgoing information through the spinal nerve goes through this part down here. This is the ventral root. So this is sensory, this is motor down here. That's incoming sensory or afferent signals. This is outgoing motor or efferent in the ventral root of the spinal nerve. Along that incoming dorsal root, there are nerve cells clustered outside of the spinal cord. This is derived from neural crest tissue of the embryo here. And we sometimes call that the dorsal root ganglion, or sometimes we call it the sensory ganglion. dorsal root ganglion or the sensory ganglion. So incoming signals come in here, and eventually they end up within this region here. All of this within this shape here, that's the gray matter. Outside of that golden brown line out here, that's white matter. Gray matter has neurons in it in abundance. White matter does not. It's simply fibers, nerve fibers traveling up and down the spinal cord, does not contain any of the gray matter, the nerve cells. So the incoming message from your dorsal root ganglion needs to come into your gray matter within this part here. That upper portion where that signal comes in right here, it's called the dorsal horn of gray matter. And so that means that this down here must be the ventral horn. From the ventral horn, you have motor neurons that send motor axons, motor nerve fibers, out to the periphery. So incoming information goes to the dorsal horn, outgoing motor information comes from the ventral horn of gray matter. In the very center of my diagram right here, we have the central canal, which contains the cerebrospinal fluid. So our dorsal horn of gray matter, ventral horn of gray matter, our white matter out here in the periphery. Our spinal nerve carries both motor and sensory signals. The dorsal root carries the sensory signals through the dorsal root ganglion to the dorsal horn. The ventral horn of gray matter has the motor neurons that send the signal out along the ventral root to the spinal nerve. Next, we're going to erase these terms associated with the spinal cord, but we'll leave the picture up here and we'll talk about a normal reflex arc of the spinal cord. All right, so here we go. We've got this cross-section of the spinal cord. We have signals that come in from the periphery, these incoming signals. These are afferent signals. They come in along a nerve fiber. That nerve fiber has a cell associated with it right here in the sensory ganglion, the dorsal root ganglion, and that signal is relayed from that cell then into the dorsal column of gray matter, the dorsal horn up there. So that is a sensory ganglion cell with its nerve fibers associated with it. Now, typically we refer to an incoming signal on a nerve fiber here, the incoming fiber, as a dendrite, and we're going to label this a sensory dendrite. Although it is not going to be called that in all textbooks and so forth. This is the incoming information. Right here, this cell is our sensory ganglion cell. And then coming from that, going into the dorsal horn of gray matter, is the axon fiber. So this is a sensory axon. This is derived from neural crest tissue, the sensory ganglion and its processes, its extensions. Now that cell is going to synapse, make junction with another cell type here within the dorsal horn of the gray matter, and that cell is going to have an axon fiber that will move down toward the ventral horn. Now this is a reflex arc, so we're just going to deal with things in this plane of the spinal cord. Here, we're not going to send things up and down the spinal cord in this drawing, but that would normally happen. That signal would be relayed out into the white matter and then travel up toward the brain. This nerve here that works between the sensory nerve and the motor nerve right here is sometimes called an association neuron, an interneuron. Some other names are given to it. We'll call it the association neuron right there. And so this would be the axon fiber, association neuron axon fiber. That connection is going to synapse with the motor neuron. Here's the motor neuron cell body right here. And that signal is going to head out in the other direction. There's your motor axon leading outward. So this one here is your motor neuron. This is the motor axon. Probably should take out the word neuron there next to association. But anyway, association axon is with the, associated with the associated neuron or accessory neuron. So this makes a complete reflex arc, so that if you have something like the hammer on the knee, kind of reflex where your knee jerks like that, or you touch something that's hot and pull back real quickly, doesn't have to send that signal all the way to the brain. Think about it to see if it needs to respond. It automatically responds in this kind of reflex arc. So there's that sensory dendrite, sensory ganglion cell in the sensory ganglion region right there, that dorsal root ganglion. And then the axon from that going into the dorsal horn of the gray matter where it interacts with this association neuron. Like I said, it could be called an interneuron or an accessory neuron. And it has a motor, axon fiber that goes down to the motor neuron. The motor neuron then has its axon that travels back the other way to carry the signal to the effector out there. Now, we've drawn all this, trying to get an understanding of this because we're going to need to look at the embryonic development of these structures here in a minute. Remember that this part right in here, that part, is derived from the early neural tube of the embryo. The remainder of this is an outgrowth, either from the motor neurons growing out from that or from neural crest tissues that form the sensory incoming branch out here. So anyway, this part out here, the dorsal and ventral root and this spinal nerve, are all considered peripheral nervous system items. In here is central nervous system. So we're going to look at this, how that develops, and that will not only be important for the spinal cord portion of your central nervous system, but many of the brain functions are going to be explained or better understood if we understand what's going on in the formation of the spinal cord. So here we are back again looking at a cross-section of the neural tube. This is neural tube here. There's some neural crest tissue there and there on either side near the top of the neural tube. And then you have your overlying surface ectoderm here. When this neural tube, before it closed up to form a tube, it was part of that surface across there and was just a thickening of the surface ectoderm. Now it's folded in, and initially, this is probably a little later than what we would see this, but anyway, the epithelial layer that makes up that neural tissue was columnar cells. So you'd have a whole series of cells here that would stretch from this outside layer, which was around near what's called a basement membrane, around the outside of that. So there would be an acellular basement membrane lying right against that on the outside. The same as there would be underneath the epithelium of the epidermis as well up there. So that's continuous. And then the inside there gets to be that neurocele, that cavity of the neural tissue. After a while, that columnar epithelium that we're familiar with starts to become a pseudostratified columnar epithelium, where some of the cells are larger at the base and narrow at the top, and then the nuclei are kind of distributed in between here at different positions. So you'll have a nucleus here. So they'll be spread out through there. So you have a pseudostratified kind of epithelium, but all of the cells still stretch between that basal surface, the original basal surface where you have your basement membrane, across to the neurocele, to that neural canal. So all of those cells are in between there. As they develop this pseudostratified look, these nuclei migrate from the more peripheral position down toward the base, and then at the base they undergo a division to separate into two cells. So you'll end up with two nuclei side by side, and they will divide there. Then those nuclei will migrate back out again. So you have this separation near the neurocele of the nuclei, and then the nuclei migrate back out toward the outer surface there. So we tend to recognize two different zones in the developing spinal cord at this stage. That portion which is closer to the neurocele is referred to as the ventricular layer. And that zone that's out away from that is sometimes called the mantle, but it's also known as the intermediate layer. I'll put in parentheses a mantle there. So the nuclear divisions happen near the ventricular layer right through here, and then the other cells that are not in some stage of division have their nuclei situated further out there. This continues for a while, increasing the number of cells in this span across here that extend between the basement membrane on the outside and the neurocele to the inside. That at some point has to stop, and that kind of division no longer occurs, and we start getting cells that are dividing between the base and the surface, isolating cells so that they no longer have both a basement membrane and a neurocele exposure there. So they're either toward the neurocele or they're out away from it. Those that end up out away from the neurocele, out over here, will eventually start to become neurons or glial cells of the nervous system. Okay, here we are looking at the cross-section spinal cord a little later. I probably put a little more detail in here than I need to for the few things that we need to label at this stage. So this is kind of an intermediate stage in the development of the spinal cord. We still have a neurocele, a cavity right here. And up and down space. It goes right down the middle. Bordering it are the cells that were part of that ventricular layer we identified a minute ago. it still could be considered ventricular layer, but these are going to become ependymal cells. Ependymal cells are like lining cells, kind of like an epithelium, but they're found next to the cerebrospinal fluid-filled passages of the brain and spinal cord. So in the ventricles of your brain and through the central canal of the spinal cord, those spaces are going to be lined with ependymal cells. So those cells right in there were part of that ventricular layer we looked at a minute ago, where we start to separate the outer cells from the inner cells in this profile. Out beyond that, we had a layer we identified as the mantle layer or the intermediate layer, and that's all in blue in here. And some of those cells become neurons. So there's a single neuron there. I'm going to put a little brown nucleus in all these neurons, these larger cells, just to make them easier to see. So our neurons are primarily located out around the margin of our mantle layer or our intermediate layer. Then finally we have a layer to the outside, we call the marginal layer. At this stage, and it contains the axon fibers from the neuron. So this neuron would have an axon fiber that would run out into here, and that fiber would either run up or down the spinal cord from that point. In the next drawing, we're going to see a separation of the tissues that are more dorsal from the more ventral tissues in a section of the spinal cord. The shape of the neurocele changes a little bit to form that division into a dorsal part and a ventral part. All right, now we've moved on to the next stage of development of the spinal cord. That space down the middle, it now has a little bit of an expansion through the center that is dividing it into a dorsal and ventral portion of the spinal cord. We still have some of the same things. This cavity in here is still a neurocele. And that will remain in there as the central canal of the spinal cord. So we have a lot of growing to do out around this before we get to its final stage. That inner layer, remember, was originally the ventricular layer, what we called it, and then we identified those cells there around that cavity, around the cavity of the neurocele, as ependymal cells. So we have those. The next layer is the intermediate layer. That intermediate layer now is divided into a cluster down here and a cluster up here. So those two clusters have new names for them. They were part of that intermediate layer, but now this is referred to as the alar plate. Up here, this cluster on either side, and then down here, these two, this is referred to as basal plate. These correspond to what we saw earlier in our cross-section of spinal cord as those associated with incoming sensory information, and then down here, these are associated with outgoing motor signals that travel from the spinal cord. Mixed in with the neurons that are part of this basal plate and alar plate are many neuroglial cells, supporting cells that are astrocytes, oligodendrocytes, microglial cells also would be found in there. This fold of the ependymal cells that comes out here to divide your alar plate and your basal plate, I forgot to give that a name there, that's called the sulcus limitans. The sulcus is a form of a groove, and limitans just means it's a border or a line of demarcation. So a limiting sulcus, separating two locations. Okay, we've advanced the development of the spinal cord a little bit further now. we have an expanse of the white matter on the outside. That layer we refer to as a marginal layer out around the edge here is expanding to form the white matter. It kind of makes a fold in the back part here. This is a posterior sulcus. Well, we call it a median sulcus. So there's your posterior median sulcus right there. This we're going to go ahead and start calling this the central canal now. Right in there, and remember it's lined with ependymal cells all around. The white matter is just nerve fibers traveling up and down. You don't have neurons in there. Our neurons are located in our gray matter. We had what we called an alar plate and a basal plate of our gray matter developing there with all of its neurons and the supporting neuroglial cells in there as well. This portion of the alar plate up here is going to house many of your neurons that will receive that incoming information. So these will have nerve fibers reaching in. Let me put that in red. So our axons from our ganglion cell will be coming in here on either side, making those important connections for our nervous system. And we're going to identify that region then as the posterior column. There's going to be another column of neurons located kind of in between the posterior and the anterior column. And we call that the lateral column. And as I said, this down here is going to be the anterior column. So incoming messages coming to the posterior column, that's our dorsal horn of gray matter. Our ventral horn of gray matter includes this anterior column here, but on the side, the lateral portion, we have a lateral column. Both of these generate motor signals that are carried out to the periphery. The anterior column, mostly somatic, the somatic motor functions. The lateral column initiates autonomic motor functions from there. So I think we've got most of this filled in now. We know the ependymal cells line the central canal. We know the neurons and glial cells are found in this gray matter, forming dorsal horns and ventral horns. This region we refer to as ventral horn also has off the side a lateral column, as well as that anterior column down here of gray matter. That's all ventral horn of gray matter, and then white matter to the outside here. Now, we had, from our motor neurons, we had fibers that go out from either side, over here. Need to fill in that over there. Other anterior column. So anyway, we kind of divide this white matter around the perimeter into different sections, and let's give those names. This portion up here is called the posterior funiculus. This region between the incoming nerve and the outgoing nerve here along the side, this is a lateral funiculus. And then down here we have an anterior funiculus. You can see that we're kind of interchanging the terms for posterior and dorsal, anterior or ventral here. So this could be called a dorsal funiculus, and this could be called a ventral funiculus. This could be called a ventral horn down here, and your posterior column could be called a dorsal column up there. At any rate, I don't think we need to do anything further with the development of spinal cord. We've seen what the adult spinal cord looks like. We know we have a ganglion derived from neural crest over here. It's sending the signal into the dorsal horn. We know that the motor signals start in the ventral horn here and are carried out the motor fibers on this side. So your ganglion will be right here, connected over to your dorsal root of your spinal nerve, and then your ventral root of your spinal nerve carries motor signals out this way. This kind of arrangement is going to continue on into the brain, from behind up in toward the brain. We're going to lose our lateral columns, they'll disappear, but our posterior column and our anterior column of gray matter will continue into the base of the brain, and we're going to look at that in our next lecture.